If God is completely sovereign, as the Bible claims that he is he to be blamed for the evil and suffering that is going on in our world or even in my life? This is an important question for us to ask, whether you're a Christian or whether you're a skeptic, whether you're an atheist, whatever the case may be. This question is so important, more important than I believe that we are aware of. Hello guys, welcome back to Applied Theology, where we talk about all things biblical, theological, and practical, helping you to apply the doctrines of the Bible to your daily life. My name is Mario, I'm a pastor, and today we're going to be talking about the sovereignty of God. Now, before we dive into this topic and the passage today, let me just say that this is a widely debated topic, this idea of God's sovereignty in relation to our capacity for human free will. As created beings that God has created. This is not new to the church, and it's widely debated among skeptics against Christianity, but it's also debated among Christians ourselves, across denominations, across churches, across different people with different viewpoints of Christianity. This is not new to the church, and it's been debated for millennia. I mean, since the beginning of the church. And so we won't be getting into all of the debates of or all of the arguments in relation to God's sovereignty and human will. Speaking of things like Calvinism, Arminianism, we won't be getting into all of that today for the sake of the video. But if you are interested in going into those things for further study, I will be linking into the description some resources that I have found helpful for me to just gain an understanding of these perspectives and to kind of work out my own understanding of the biblical texts. And so I will be providing that for you. And I will also be providing my notes for the video for anyone who would be willing to download. If, say, God has put it on your heart to lead a Bible study through James, I'm going to start putting my notes out there and available for free use to be able to be used as a resource as you guys grow and take the lead in leading in your own communities through the book of James. Now, as we get in, let us remember that James is already in the beginning elements of chapter 1. He's already kind of established this groundwork of God's sovereignty, this theological groundwork for God's sovereignty. And we find this right off the get-go in the epistle of James in verse 2 of chapter 1, where he says, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith will produce maturity in Christ and endurance and all of these things. And so what he's alluding to is the fact that God can use even evil and suffering, sickness, anything bad that comes into our life and comes against our faith. God can use it to make us to be what he wants us to be and to give himself all of the glory that he desires. That is, in a nutshell, what it means for God to be sovereign. He is ruler over all things. He is in control. He governs the nations of the world. He governs the aspects of my life. But the question is, does God directly cause certain sufferings or certain evils that come against me in my faith? And that's really the debate. But what happens when you don't believe, not in God's sovereignty, but that God's sovereignty is actually working for your good? What happens when you struggle to believe that? Because you and I both know that when we're experiencing suffering, it's hard for us to see how God allowing suffering in our life is going to produce anything good. When we are going through it, we're going through it. I mean, when you're sick, when you get the diagnosis, when you lose someone, when you are going through a financial situation, the thing that just stays before you is the problem. We've talked about in past videos how James is trying to get us into the practice of not focusing on what we see, which, by the way, that doesn't mean ignoring what we see. It just means that our primary focus is on what we don't see, the thing behind the thing we talked about, which is Jesus. And so that is why in our passage today, James understands this dilemma that we experience when we kind of touch on the topic of God's sovereignty and suffering and evil. James understands that, and that is why in our passage today, he is going to give us some encouragement in relation to that, but also he's going to give us a sober reminder of what God's sovereignty actually means for you practically. Because I think a lot of us sometimes could inherit some false views of God's sovereignty. And that's not to say that the debate between, say, Arminianism and Calvinism is a bad thing or heretical. It's simply to say that there are times when we kind of attribute blame to God when he is not to blame. And we do it on basis because he is sovereign, or we read that he is sovereign. And I think that that is a false kind of view of God's sovereignty, and we could fall into that trap if all we see and focus on is the here, the now, what I'm experiencing. What we want to do today is look at what James says in regards to sovereignty and what we're experiencing in our sufferings and circumstances and things of that nature. But before we go on, let me just encourage you, if you like content like this, if you like anything biblical, Bible study based, or theological, I encourage you to subscribe below and maybe like the video and share the video. That really helps a lot and encourages me when I see that you are encouraged by the video. So thank you guys for joining us for this video. And so today, as we dive into our scripture in the book of James, we're going to be in chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. I know we're still in chapter 1, but again, we're going through it slowly to grab every element that we can. And today we're trying to understand, get what James is talking about in regards to God's sovereignty and what that means for our circumstances, how we can be encouraged in that, but how we can also have a sober understanding of God's sovereignty and not an exaggerated one or an incorrect one. And so that is what we're going to be looking at today. So, and excuse my, the program is glitching for some reason. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just a moment, whatever the case. So excuse the glitches as we work through this. But hey, what can you do? So we are going to be starting off in verse 12 of chapter 1. And so we're going to read through the whole passage together. And we will then circle back to the beginning and kind of pick it apart, exegete the passage a little bit, and kind of grab some understandings that we kind of need to pick apart for us to understand what James is getting at when he talks of God's sovereignty and his role in our circumstances and things of that nature. So, verse 12, this is what he says. He says, "Blessed is the man." Now, when he says man, he's saying person, or essentially, he's just saying blessed is the person. It's not necessarily used in a gender kind of exclusive term here. He's using it just generally, like mankind. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Okay, so he's going back. We're going to just highlight this. He's going back to what he was talking about in the very beginning of chapter 1. Blessed is the person who remains steadfast under trial, for when they have stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one, when he is tempted, this is very important for us to pay attention to. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, for he himself tempts no one. Very important for us to understand. He himself tempts no one. But, and here we go, he's going to kind of start to get into how temptation is pretty much produced. He says, but each person is tempted when he or she is lured and enticed by their own desire. And desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And when sin is fully grown, it brings forth death. And when he goes on and he says, do not be deceived, my brothers and sisters. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Every good gift, every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we would be a kind of first fruits of his creation, that we would be a kind of first fruits of his creation. That's also an important little aspect to what he is saying. And we're going to stop here today in our adventure through almost the end of chapter 1 of the book of James. So here's the deal. James circles back to what he started to mention in chapter 1, verse 2, right? Where he kind of laid this groundwork of God's sovereignty, using our trials to produce endurance, and that endurance produces maturity. He goes back to this perspective of faith and how this faith plays out in the believer's life. For the person who loves God and endures trial, there is a reward for them. This is what James starts off with. So remember how we talked about in the beginning that James wants to encourage us in the idea of God's sovereignty. He wants to encourage us in the idea that God is using our circumstances for our good. And so, excuse me, I don't know why it's glitching out like that. But anyways, so he mentions this term, the crown of life. That is a very interesting term. And actually, this whole piece here is it's very interesting, actually. The way he words, blessed is the man who remains under trial when he has stood the test, for he will receive the crown of life, which has been promised to those who love him. It's interesting the way he words this sentence. Remember, this is Jesus's half brother who ended up believing in Jesus as Lord and as Messiah after Jesus was resurrected. If you remember the first video we made on this and went through kind of a backstory of James the Just, he believed post-resurrection. And so it's interesting that he's kind of taken on some of the characteristics of his own brother's teaching style. If we go to Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 3 all the way to verse 10, we kind of get this feel in Jesus' teaching. For example, in verse 3, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You could see how James is kind of mimicking his brother's style, Jesus' style of teaching. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. I just find that very interesting. But it's very interesting what he says about this crown of life. He is giving us and this is what he's encouraging us with. When we are going through trial, when we are going through hardship, there is a goal in mind for God, right? These things are not just happening in a vacuum. God is not directly causing these things. And there's huge debate on this, but I personally don't believe that God is directly causing all the suffering and evil that is happening in the world or in my life, but he is using it as a test to push me on towards the goal. And that goal would be to be made to look like and act like and be like his son, Jesus. And so this word that he uses, the crown of life, is an interesting phrasing of the word. The Greek word gives this picture. It actually literally means mark of royalty, a mark of royalty, which in Greece, this word carried with it the imagery of like, if you would think about the Olympics. So in Greece, they had these games, these public games that would go on, and it was literally like the Olympics. It was just these public games, tournaments, and things like that. And, at the end, like the Olympics, you get a medal, right? You get like a medal if you win, to kind of symbolize you're victorious, you made it, you endured that test of strength or test of endurance, whatever the case may be, whatever sport it was. And the idea, at least in Greece, was that you were crowned with a garland. You were crowned with this diadem of royalty, that you were honored as victorious for your endurance and your perseverance in the task of whatever sport it was. And that's the imagery that is being carried with this word, the crown of life, for those who love God. And the picture that James is trying to paint for us is that our trials, at least from God's perspective in the way that he's using it, is seen as like a race. Paul talks about this when he says, like, I have ran the race. In 2 Timothy, he says, I've run the race, I've finished the fight. This idea that we're running to obtain a prize, right? We're running with a goal, and trials are things that propel us. They're the things that we encounter in the middle of the race that kind of push back or prevent us from going further, or causing some hindrance, or slowing us down, or whatever the case may be. You could take this imagery so far. But the point is that James is trying to paint this picture of a race, of going after something with a goal in mind. And for us, the goal is this crown of life, which is eternal life, to be marked forever by being known by God, by being God's son or daughter, by being adopted, by being justified and glorified and redeemed, to be marked by that eternally. And that is what we're going after as we work through these trials. Now, he goes on. Now, that was his encouragement, right? That was James's encouragement for us as we work through kind of this idea of sovereignty, how God uses our circumstances. Let no one say when he is tempted. This is interesting. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot, okay? He cannot. That's interesting. God can't do something. Interesting. Be tempted with evil, for he himself tempts no one. These two things here are linked. This trial and temptation usually is used synonymously by James. When he says trial, he could also mean temptation. And when he says temptation, he could also mean trial. It's kind of used synonymously. But in this particular instance, he is drawing a contrast between trial and temptation. In the first part of this passage, he's talking about trial in the sense of circumstance, or things that are coming up, things that are in general understanding of trial. It could include temptation, but he's talking very generally about temptation or trial or circumstance or suffering, whatever the case may be. He's kind of putting it all in this word of trial. And he kind of gives this brief look as to why we can remain blessed under trial because God is using it. Now, when he goes and he talks about being tempted, it brings about an interesting thing, because he says God cannot be tempted with evil. And this is what he's trying to get at. God's sovereignty does not mean direct responsibility for all situations. When James is getting at the fact that God is sovereign and using all situations in our life for his glory and our flourishing, it does not mean that God is directly responsible for all the situations that are in our life. Again, there's big debate over this, but this is why I believe he mentions and kind of casts this distinction between temptation and this word trial, because he says God cannot be tempted with evil. And this kind of answers our question that we're kind of looking for. Can God be blamed for the evil going on because he is all sovereign? No, he cannot be blamed for the evil going on. Though God sovereignly uses our suffering, keyword uses, he does not cause the evil. He does not cause directly all of the suffering. Now, we can get into a whole other topic of God's judgment and his wrath and things of that nature, the suffering that comes about from his wrath. In those instances, yes, God is the direct cause of suffering and the direct cause of hardship. But none of that in God's perspective is evil, because God cannot do evil. Even his wrath, even his judgment is good. It is just, and there is no injustice in his wrath or in his going about of judgment. There's no corruption in that, like we see in our world today. But maybe you might ask, well, God is sovereign and in control of all things, right? Doesn't that include my temptations and the evil that comes against me? This is where James gets into this sober view of God's sovereignty. And I think that this is just as important as the encouragement that he gives starting in verse 12. James is clear about where temptation comes from. He's very clear. Temptation comes from your desire. You and me, our desire in the instinctiveness of our humanity, in the very core of who we are by nature wicked because of our inherited wickedness from Adam in Genesis 3. So essentially what James does is he takes the tendency to blame God for the suffering or the evil in the world, or to say things like, which is a very popular argument against Christianity that kind of falls apart when you actually read the Bible. Because there is evil and suffering in the world, God therefore cannot exist. When you read the Bible, obviously this is not true at all. And actually it points to greater evidence of God, because why would we label anything as evil or suffering if we didn't have a standard by which we can measure that and determine that that is what we would call evil, or that is what we would call something that is suffering? Again, I mentioned this last video, animals don't do this, right? If we were purely naturalistic, we wouldn't be asking these questions. And, you could go into longer debates in regards to this. But again, essentially what James is doing is he's taking the blame off of God and pointing it down to us. And he's saying, hey, listen, God is not to be blamed for most of the time it would be our bad decisions. There are times in our life where we bring on suffering to ourselves. By the decisions that we're making, we heap on ourselves trial. When we engage in sinful activities, there are consequences for those things, which a lot of the consequences for sin is things that destroy our life. This is what it means in Romans chapter 6, when Paul says the end of those things is death in regards to sin. The wages of sin is death. It is destruction. And so when we engage in sin, obviously we can expect to reap destruction. But not all suffering is because of that. There's suffering just because we live in a broken world. He is using all things to accomplish his will, but we also recognize that we are completely responsible for the decisions that we make that may or may not cause suffering upon ourselves. And this is why this is what I mean when I say that James is giving us a sober understanding of God's sovereignty, because the tendency in times of suffering is to what? Blame God. The tendency is to say that God is unjust. The tendency is to say that God is doing something wrong, when the reality is God isn't necessarily causing any of this suffering. We're maybe just experiencing it because we live in a broken world where there's death and there's pain and there's hardship. Or maybe it's simply just because you are engaging in some sin that is causing consequences, that is creating a trial in you. Now, that doesn't mean that we're completely hopeless. That in any trial, again, James talks about this, whatever the trial is, God can use it to glorify himself and to build in us endurance, to endure more suffering and to finish the race and be crowned with the mark of royalty. So as we end the video today, let's just be encouraged about what James encouraged us with. If you're going through a trial right now, know that God is completely sovereign over that trial. He didn't directly cause it, but he is sovereign over it. And he is using it to glorify himself and to create in you what he desires to create in you. He is molding you through that trial. He is shaping you to look like Jesus, and he is building in you endurance to continue to run this race and to run it well. And so let us be encouraged by that, but let us also have a sober understanding of God's sovereignty, that God is completely sovereign, but he is not to blame for all the suffering and all of the evil in the world. There are a lot of other complexities of human brokenness and sin and all of these other things that aren't the fault of God. Yet at the same time, he is 100% sovereign over all things. And so thank you guys for watching the video today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I love doing these videos. Please like the video, subscribe if you want more content like this. Please engage with me in the comments. Maybe post down some topics that maybe you would like to discuss, you would like some videos on, or maybe just engage what we talked about today. What do you think about God's sovereignty? Where do you land in this kind of wrestling with this passage? If you're going through a trial, I would love to pray for you. Please put that down in the comments. Again, just let's engage with each other, and I hope to see you guys on the next video. Thank you guys for joining me today. Blessings.